biggest, broadest category, protists. It's not very specific. There's millions of them. All right, but I know that algae is a kind of a protist. And then I know that plankton is a kind of algae. So we're kind of making a hierarchy of most general to a little more specific. You want to try and work on that as you go through your either your biological path or your medicine, dentistry, nursing pathway. It's a hierarchy from broad to a little more specific to a little more specific as we go through these. Now, plankton can even be further subdivided because what's important about plankton is that they support the food chain of marine or aquatic systems. A lot of a lot of things eat plankton. If you didn't have plankton, we probably won't have fish. So we got to keep them from disappearing. Well, there's two major types of plankton. I want you to tell me what they use for their energy source. So one kind of plankton is phytoplankton. What do they use for their energy source? Sunlight. How do you know that? Because phyto, right? Photosynthesis. You can call them photoplankton if you want, but they're kind of pronounced phytoplankton. And then you have these guys. Make that not a 2, but a bigger Z. What do you think zooplankton are going to eat? What does zoo make you think of? Animals. So they're eating animals. They're eating other protists. And these make up the two largest groups of plankton. So really, who eats plankton? Yeah, I mean, these guys are microscopic. You're not going to be able to hold one in your hand and go, oh, look at that little cute phytoplankton. They're teeny tiny. You're going to be using microscopes tomorrow to try and see some of these things. And yet you've got the biggest animals on the planet that survive off of these things. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling. The bigger you are, the smaller the things you eat. It doesn't make sense. So this is why they're called filter feeders. Does anybody know what this thing is? It's a shark. Right? Now when you hear shark, you think, oh my God, run or swim really fast. Don't go in the water. But it's a whale shark. What do they eat? Phytoplankton and zooplankton. They eat plankton, which is why that snorkeler is not concerned. And that's why these guys are on my bucket list. I want to swim into the mouth of a whale shark. Right? They have no teeth. They're filter feeders. They're actually just trying to filter out, like you would pour water through a filter, millions and millions and millions of little protists known as zooplankton. They're really docile and quite calm. All right.
Actually swim into their mouths?
Huh?
Can you actually swim into their mouths?
Sure. They're not going to bite you.
How do you get out?
You swim back out. I mean, they swim with their mouth open.
Oh, okay.
And then they're just kind of filtering the water. They might close it and squish the water out, but if they do, you just hang on and then get spat back out, like Jonah, who's maybe what swallowed her. Who knows? All right, other kinds of unicellular algae. You ever heard of dinoflagellates? You may not. How about diatoms? No? Ever heard of red tide? Okay, now we're in that category. All right, so other examples of unicellular algae besides, zooplankton and phytoplankton or protozoans, you have dinoflagellates, diatoms, and green algae. It's all you need to memorize. Don't need to memorize their descriptions. And examples of these guys, because they're so microscopic and so teeny tiny. If we go to the multicellular stage, and we've already seen pictures of these, you have the green algae, the red algae, and brown. The reason they're called different types of algae is because they contain different kind of pigments in their chloroplasts. What do chloroplasts do? They do what? No, you said something. What did you say?
Nothing.
Said nothing. Okay, which means she said something, but she doesn't want to admit it, which means she's guilty. Okay. They do photosynthesis, right. So these are photosynthetic algae. They just happen to have a green-colored pigment, which is why they look green. They happen to have a red-colored pigment, which is why they look red. And they happen to have a brown-colored pigment, that's why they look brown. Pretty simple. Here's some examples of dinoflagellates. There are thousands of different ones, and each one has a bloody name to them. Not even in my wheelhouse of attempt. Just realize that to me they look like seashells that are alive. That's how I imagine them. And they're known as dinoflagellates. They're also responsible for red tides. So if you hear about a red tide explosion, you think, all right, that's due to a dinoflagellate. All right, and what the hell is a dinoflagellate? It is a unicellular algae. What are algae? Oh, they're a protease. So you kind of think about how you want to kind of practice and organize it, right? Proteases are very general, non-specific. Algae, a little more specific. What kind of algae is it? Oh, it's a unicellular algae. What kind of a unicellular allergy? Good God. What kind of a unicellular algae is it? Oh, it happens to be a dinoflagellate. Or it happens to be a diatom. Or there are some also green algae that are unicellular, not necessarily multicellular. Okay, and this is why I'm not a marine biologist. There's just way too much crap to keep in your head. But this is what a red tide looks like. They're very common off of the East Coast. Some of them are very, very toxic. This is why, what's the rule about eating shellfish? If it ends in an R, you don't eat it, because that's a month that could experience a red tide. And there's a really nasty toxin that can kill most organisms that come from red algae. Now, the problem is sort of how you think about ecosystems. I might eat how can one stupid oyster kill me? Well, what is the oyster eating? Dinoflagellates. So they accumulate the toxin. And that's the problem with bottom chain animals. The oyster will probably gain lots of toxins. Then I go eat lots of oysters. I'm getting a ton of toxins. And if there is a red tide explosion, you want to stay away from the water. If you swallow it, you might get sick. If you swallow enough of it, it could kill you. If you eat shellfish that have been laden with the toxin, then you want to avoid the shellfish, because that will kill you. But all they really are is an explosion of population. There's so many of them that actually turn the water red. And all they are is a big swarm of dinoflagellates, which is an example of unicellular algae, which is a kind of a protease. You want to just keep practicing that over and over again. How do these little buggers move? Well, if they have flagella, then I can classify the protease as a flagellate. All right, that seems pretty straightforward. And if they have cilia, I'm going to call them a ciliate. So their name, in terms of their category, tells you how you can think about how they go about getting around. Either you have a flagella or you have cilia. Now, amoebas, they move, but they don't move by cilia, and they really don't move by flagella. They move by what's called a pseudo. What does pseudo refer to? If I'm a pseudo instructor, then what am I? I'm a fake. Pseudo means not real. What does podia refer to? Foot. Fake foot. These guys don't have a real foot. They don't have cilia. They don't have flagella. They actually, it's like a hug in a sense. They engulf their prey. So if we go back to this picture of an amoeba way back here, this is Pseudopodia, and it's going to swallow this poor paramecium. And that's how it eats. It's also how it moves. It's like watching a blob move across the floor. A blob has no foot, has no arms, no legs. It seems to kind of just roll itself across the floor. We're going to see another picture of a pseudopodia in a moment. Oh, one important thing just to keep you guys up to date. Most biologists, I kind of forgot about this until I rewrote this slide, don't call them red tides. what most scientists and health officials actually call them are harmful algal blooms, otherwise HABs. So in case you ever hear of a harmful algal bloom or algal bloom, then you really know, well, why do they simply just say a red tide? Same thing. Now, if you move by flagella, you're a flagellate. If you move by cilia, you're a ciliate. If you're an amoeba, you move with pseudopodia. Now, we also have other types of pseudopodia using protists, guys that are called foraminifera. There's 3 main groups of foraminifera. We're not going to go there. But you now know that foraminifera are a type of a protist. One last one. If you go hiking, you're going to come across this. This is a slime mold. Now you know a slime mold is a protist. They have a unique kind of a life cycle. You look at them. There's this one, and then there's this look. It looks like kind of like cauliflower or broccoli in a sense. There are 2 main groups of slime molds, a plasmodial, and you don't really need to memorize that one. I want you to look at the life stages of the other one. But the plasmodial ones are the ones you find that look like mold on decaying organic matter. Like if you find a dead branch or a dead tree or a pile of leaves, and it has this kind of a fungus looking like stuff, something that looks like this, up in the top, then you know that, okay, that's slime mold. It's actually decaying and breaking down the organic matter of the wood. What's interesting about slime molds is that they're probably a great source for science fiction movies because of another kind called cellular slime molds that has 3 major parts to its life cycle. The first part is the feeding stage. They're individual cells. They're just decomposing the leaves, the trees. The second part, though, is a swarming stage, where all the individual cells come together to form one big snot ball. And they're kind of scary looking. Then they have the reproductive stage, where they form like a little mushroom-like thing. And these are what their stages look like. Here's an individual cell. It looks like an amoeba. All right, that's fine. They're feeding on bacteria and other stuff. But then you get millions of them to come together, and it forms a snot ball. Or what I look at as a puppy embryo, where you got the head and the nose over here. But this thing's actually moving. It can actually move towards you if you're sitting down having your lunch, and it senses the organic matter in your lunch. It will move towards you. Not very quickly, but you'll see it actually kind of, it wasn't that shape 20 minutes ago, and it wasn't that close to me. It might take hours, right? But it will move. And all it's doing is it's not trying to get to you to feed. It's actually in its dying stage. What it's going to do is it's going to group together to form a stalk-like thing. So here it is as a slime mold, in terms of a mold of slime. But this is its reproductive stage, and then there are spores in there. And what it's doing is it realizes it's out of food. It's about to die. So it wants to create the next generation. So it creates a stalk to get it off the ground for the breeze to pick up the spores and to spread them just a little bit further away from where, in a sense, my relatives were. Really can't call them mom and dad because there's no sperm and such. But this is kind of a bizarre creature. It lives by itself when it's feeding and happy, but it realizes there's nothing else to decay, to break down. It forms a big pile of snot-like stuff, and then it forms a stalk where it releases lots of spores, and then it dies. But what I want you to really realize is that when you're walking around the forest and you see what looks like yellow cauliflower or a yellow kind of a net-like material over leaves and branches and trees, you're actually looking at what's called slime mold, which is a type of protist, which is an odd eukaryote. All right, there's your little crash course in protists. I do want to point out one thing that I forgot to mention to you guys that it did, hey, come back here, intentionally, for you guys to get used to it. If you look at the slide that talks about how protists move, protist is the new word. When I went through high school and got my first college degree, we used the word protozoan. Then they finally changed the name from protozoan to protists. But, huh? I don't know. 11. A lot of books and people, they'll still use the word protozoan. So if you hear the word protozoan, you should be thinking protist. If you see the word protist and someone talks about protozoans, they're the same thing. It is just the old name compared to the more supposedly accurate scientific way of describing them. All right, let's see what we can do with some animals. What?
About the zooplankton?
Uh-huh.
You said they eat other animals?
They eat other planktons. Yeah, other protists. So in a way, they're kind of carnivorous. They're like carnivore,
Zoo animal.
eating their own kind. Really nasty little critters. All right, so practice the overall category. Protists are a type of eukaryote, but then there's different types of protists. You have algae, unicellular and multicellular, different kinds of algae, and such to go through. All right, let's get you guys started with animals. And a lot of this will be on the final exam. Most of this won't be on your upcoming Thursday exam because you guys don't have enough time to memorize it all. So I want you to go back a long time. So the first several slides are not in your notes. This is just me being goofy. Go back millions and millions of years ago. You are now going to land on Earth for the very first time, and so you're spying on it. You're looking at it through your little telescope. And you see this little thing in this little galaxy called Earth. So you send your trusted little aide to go down to Earth, to land on Earth and figure out what kind of life you have living there. So you show up with your buddy. Anybody recognize this, by the way? Okay, you should. You need to. This is the original The Day the Earth Stood Still. This is a guy who's coming to Earth not to invade, but to save our butts from destroying ourselves with nuclear weapons. And that his robot, Klaatu, to protect the ship. And then he goes around and he saves mankind. But he arrives on Earth trying to figure out what it is that he's looking at, what kind of animals and creatures there are. So here you are, coming to look at a mammal known as a rabbit. You take your ray gun and you try and shoot it. And everybody knows you stick a carrot in a ray gun that it stops the ray gun from working. Right? But the whole approach of this is, if you land on a planet, how do you organize, how do you classify the types of life you find on that planet? So we know that animals are eukaryotes because they have a cell membrane, they have a membrane-bound nucleus, they have organelles. That's why they're eukaryotes. Animals are multicellular. There's no such thing as really a truly single-celled animal. And we know they're heterotrophs because they have to eat other things to get their carbon and to get their energy. Now they have cells that lack cell walls. What else do eukaryotes not have? Come on, folks. You've had this before on your last exam. Don't have chloroplasts, and what else don't they have? Don't have the vacuole. Exactly. All right. Now, they also use ingestion, which is their way of getting food. Right? You swallow your food. You don't set it on your arm and have it absorbed through your skin. You have to actually ingest or swallow, which is going to make this rather complicated for animals because that requires a whole new set of skills and a whole new set of structures that most organisms don't have. For example, mushrooms. Right? Mushrooms are fungus. They don't ingest their food. They literally grow on top of it and they absorb, kind of like slime mold. They absorb their nutrients. So animals make this really kind of tricky. So we're going to walk through the different types of animals from the most simplest to the more complex by the time we're totally done with this. What you want to ask is, where did they come from? What are they? And who are they? How do they live in a sense? Well, if we go back to the idea of protists that we just talked about, remember protists are not animals, and they're not really plants, and they're not really fungus. We can maybe look at protists as an evolutionary origin for animals in one sense. What if you took a protist that was all by itself, right? We have lots of single-cell protists, and they came up to form colonies. And then you would say, well, there's no example of a protist actually wanting to form like an apartment complex or a colony. And then you go, wait, yes there is. There's one big round green one called Volvox that lives in a spherical colony. Oh, so there is some truth to your argument a little bit. But then we have to specialize all the different cells that are living in this little colony-like structure. Well, how do we specialize them? Well, what if you had a spherical structure where every single individual cell, for some reason, started to group together? Sort of like how phospholipids would do. Maybe there's a benefit to living in a sphere. The idea is, there is some proof to this. What if you then had some cells, some members of your colony went through a little bit of a mutation? And what if that mutation allowed for specialization? These guys started to create a talent that the rest of the cells didn't have. And what if, for some reason, these cells started to move inwards, what's called invagination? Well, if I look at it in terms of how many layers do I have here, I only have one layer. But if for some silly reason they started to invaginate on themselves, to move inwards, they create layers. And then what if they kept doing it until I formed kind of a two-layered structure with a hollow cavity in the middle of it? Think, well, that's totally impossible. No cells or no group of cells would go through this. This is the beginning of your embryonic development. This is how we actually grow after fertilization. We form these layers. We form a solid ball that becomes a hollow sphere that begins to fold in on itself to create the major layers of your tissue types. We do this exact same thing. Well, let's see if this actually works. Probably should have pasted this. Yeah. There it is. All right, I'll have to fix that. All right, so let's go back to those folding layers. When you guys are an embryo, which means right after fertilization, you're going to go from an embryo to being a fetus. The important thing is what happens in your embryonic development as you get from 2 cells to 4 to 16 to 8. What happens during the first several weeks of pregnancy, in a sense, is this idea right here. All right? We're looking at what's called a zygote, which we know comes from the fertilization of egg and sperm. So, single-celled things become a multicellular structure called a zygote. Zygotes will become embryos. And embryos develop by going through these major stages. A blastula is a hollow ball of cells. So if I look at this is a blastula. It's a hollow ball of cells. Yeah, it's got liquid in the center, but it's a hollow sphere, like a ball. All right. Now, the process called gastrula, or gastrulization, that's the process. Let me do it that way. So I got, gastrulization is the process of folding in on yourself. And if you're folding in on yourself, we don't call you a blastula anymore. We call you a gastrula. So here is a blastula. Now you begin to fold on yourself. We call you a gastrula. And this process of folding is called gastrulization. when you go through gastrulization, you create the three primary types of tissue that make up all of you, or any animal. You create what's called ectoderm. Ecto means outside. So ectoderm forms your skin and your nervous system. It forms your brain. The mesoderm is in the middle, which is kind of cool because it begins with an M. It's easy to remember. Mesoderm forms all of your internal organs, which means if I roll the clock back as a developing embryo and I look at your three major layers, I can put radioactive things, isotopes, in these cells, and I can follow them and watch what they grow into, which is how we know ectoderm forms skin, how mesoderm forms your internal organs, and how endoderm lines your digestive tract. Now, this is the cells that are responsible for you absorbing nutrients. So we actually know how we grow embryonically. We actually even know what group of cells become what part of your body. Now, with those, let's look at an example of this gastrulization process. So here we have a starfish. They use sexual reproduction because they're using egg and sperm. So then you get a zygote, one cell, but one become many, but it's a solid ball of cells. Then it turns into a hollow ball called a blastula. Then it begins to fold in on itself. So this is now a gastrula going through gastrulization. And you can see now that it has future mesoderm that's in the middle between this layer and the yellow layer. We know that that will then form internal organs. Then you have an endoderm because it's on the inside, and this is going to be the ectoderm because it's on the outside. And when you watch this gastrulization process, it forms a thing called a larva. But what's interesting is that when it's all done growing, it turns into a starfish. And that process of going from something unrelated to your final shape is called metamorphosis. So you ever seen maggots? What do maggots turn into? Flies. But do maggots look like flies? No. So it goes through metamorphosis. How about a caterpillar? Does it look like a butterfly? No, right? Doesn't look like your final stage. So anything that has a, we call a larval stage, has to go through the process of metamorphosis to become the final adult version. We don't go through metamorphosis, right? We're born as our young as just little teeny versions of us. And I'm going to reinforce that idea in a moment. So, many animals, when born or hatched, are mini-me's. How about a chicken? A chick looks like a chicken, right? A baby bird like an adult bird. Puppies look like dogs, right? But many don't. A lot of animals go through this metamorphosis process where they have eggs and sperm that go through gastrulization that creates this multicellular thing called a larva. But this has to go through a process of metamorphosis, going from the baby stage to the adult stage in a sense. Now, how does it know where to form the antennae and the wings and the legs from my larva to my adult form? Think about a caterpillar. Where do the wings come from? Or a maggot, for God's sakes, right? It doesn't even have any legs, but flies have legs. They have antennae. They have wings. So how do these goofy cells know that my job is to become a wing, an antenna, or a leg? Exactly, genes. What kind of genes? They're called Hox genes. Hox genes control metamorphosis. Hox genes determine what part of your body becomes what part of your body. So Hox genes control metamorphosis. They determine what part of your body becomes what. Like where your eyes are, where your ears are, where your arms are compared to your legs. Animals are the only living thing on this planet that have Hox genes. Plants don't have them. Funguses don't have them. because they don't have a consistent body plan. Now, how do we know about Hox genes? Because we have some really cruel scientists, or some really scary scientists. They took a fly. Well, let me first remind you of metamorphosis, right? So we go from the final adult form to an egg, right? Something that doesn't look like the original final end product of the adult, and it goes through a metamorphosis. Here's our version of little mini me's, which most animals don't have to go through metamorphosis then. What happened to, oh, I moved it, that's right, okay. So, thinking about now Hox genes, controlling what part of your body becomes what. Thinking about now this idea of individual cells having come together and they become specialized. They each now have a different job. Well, we can think about that Cambrian explosion we've been talking about for plants, where you get this large increase in the number of living organisms. What could be responsible for having such a large number of different animals? The appearance of those Hox genes. Genes got a mutation, and they have a job now of determining where your head is, where your arms are, where your heart is. That also allowed for then what we call God, my tongue isn't working today. Ecological changes, meaning the ecology, the habitat, the place you live. And the idea of predator and prey. Predators eat prey. Prey's job is to avoid the predator. If I'm a really good prey, I'm not going to be eaten by the predator. So how does the predator get to survive? They have to go through mutations. Well, now the predator is a super predator. You're going to kill all the prey. So how do the prey survive? They have to go through mutations. So everybody keeps mutating. It's like a contest. If you become better prey, I need to become a better predator. But now I'm a better predator. She needs to become even better prey. Now she's better prey than I am a predator. I need to mutate to become an even better predator. And then the prey has to mutate. And the predators have to mutate. Everybody keeps getting better year after year. The analogy of it is, well, actually none of you grew up during this. I grew up during the Cold War in the 60s. And the reason we ended the Cold War was Ronald Reagan spending hundreds of millions and billions of dollars on our military. All we really did is outproduce the next largest army, known as the Russians or the Soviet Union. And we got so many bombs and armies that we both said, this is not really worth it. If I launch an attack, it's total annihilation. But each country got more powerful than the other.